This segment we're going to be talking about where you can expect to find asbestos. If you go on to certain places on the internet that are about asbestos, you can see that there are 1,000 places in the house that you can potentially find asbestos. Anywhere from the roofing to the linoleum backing to, it can be in the attic, it can be on your on the tape and the sheetrock. But for you and I, as the realtor and the home inspector, the two places that it is by far the most commonly found and the most likely to cause problems would be the popcorn ceiling texture that you see. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that I'd started as a home inspector back in 1993. And back then, my experience when I saw a popcorn ceiling texture was that it was about, I'm going to say 40-60 in favor of it not being asbestos. But what has happened over time is that when the popcorn ceiling texture was tested and found to be asbestos, more often than the other way, they would find out it's asbestos and decide to leave it up there because they didn't want to deal with it. The stuff that doesn't have asbestos tends to come down a lot more often. So as a result, now that we're decades past the 90s, what you pretty much find is about 80+% of the time when you see that popcorn ceiling texture, it's got the asbestos in it. As I talk about popcorn ceiling texture, I go back to the early 70s. As I was growing up, I actually watched my dad add asbestos. It was actually in a bag, kind of like a concrete bag. He mixed up the popcorn ceiling texture material, and then he would actually add this bag of asbestos into it. And he thought it was awesome stuff. And of course, I think I remember him saying, "Hey, this is perfectly safe, no worries." But there was that little cloud of asbestos fibers as he was dumping that stuff in. And then, of course, you're spraying that stuff up onto the ceiling. And at that point, it may be a little less dangerous because theoretically it's encapsulated into the mud, but you never know. You see that material, and like I say, 80 to 90% chance that it does contain asbestos, or that it's an ACM or asbestos-containing material. The other place that it is fairly common to see asbestos is actually on ducts. You get the homes that were built in the 70s or earlier, and one of the things they thought was a good idea was to wrap the joints of the ducts with this asbestos tape. And the idea was to seal these ducts so that the air would not leak out and it would go where you want it to go. The asbestos duct liner tape generally is going to be up in your ceiling, perhaps behind sheetrock. It's generally not going to be disturbed, and so this is much less likely to be a problem. Still potentially a problem, but less likely to be a problem than the popcorn ceiling texture. You can imagine, we all, if you're of the male persuasion, as we were growing up, we wanted to see how high we could jump, and back when we were 5'0", being able to touch the ceiling was one important thing that proves that you were getting there. So if you're jumping regularly and touching the ceiling and it's got the asbestos ceiling texture on there, every time you touch that ceiling, you're releasing fibers down into the air where they can be breathed. Similarly, maybe somebody wants to clean up the spider webs or just the dirt that is on that ceiling texture. If you sweep it or vacuum it or whatever you do, you're releasing thousands or perhaps tens of thousands, who knows how many fibers into the air where it can stay and just wait to be breathed in and go into the lungs. If you have the popcorn ceiling texture, one of the things that, and we're going to cover EPA recommendations for what you can do in the next segment, but there are options, I guess. If you happen to have, besides the popcorn ceiling texture and the ducts, you can actually have asbestos used as an insulator. Now, what that can mean, you can have it on flues, you can have it on pipes, you You've got the tape, you can have it on the walls like I'd mentioned. A third place that I will often see asbestos. Sometimes you'll have these older homes where maybe there was a wood fireplace or an older sort of a furnace that put out a lot of heat. And in many cases you will have, the wall here and the pipe right next to it. And, the pipe is obviously going to be hot, and, maybe it was done in 1950 or whatever, and they didn't want to burn the house down. That's a very reasonable thing to want to do. So you'll have, in many cases, you'll have a sheet of asbestos located between the wall and the pipe. And when I, as the home inspector, will see that quite often, the first inclination is, that's asbestos, remove it. You don't want to remove it. And there's a number of reasons why, but first off is if you disturb it, that's a problem. Secondly, if you remove that asbestos, there's a chance that, the house might burn down. That asbestos was put up there for a reason, and it probably ought to stay unless you don't have any other options. In the next segment, we're going to talk about EPA recommendations and what your options may be. Be right back.